Good evening, everyone. A very warm welcome to you from the Australian National University here in Canberra. I hope that you and your loved ones are keeping safe and healthy. I'd like to acknowledge the Ngunnawal and the Ngambri people who are the traditional owners of the land where the Australian National University is located, and I pay my respects to the elders past and present. We are pleased to welcome to this webinar attendees from various parts of Australia and from around the globe, including India, Burma, Indonesia, and Fiji. Knowledge is power, and our weekly webinar series allows us to share and learn from each other's experiences during the pandemic. I am Associate Professor Dipti Talaulikar, a clinical hematologist and the program lead for the ANU COVID-19 Peer Support Program. Joining me today are my colleagues, Mr. Jay Poria, International Relations Manager, and Devashee Paliwal, second-year medical student, both from the Australian National University. Before I introduce our esteemed speakers for today, a couple of housekeeping notes for everyone. You will have noticed that videos and microphones have been switched off. This is just to improve reduce interference during the webinar and keep the sound quality clear. We encourage everyone to ask questions at any time during the webinar using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. You have the option of asking questions anonymously if you want. Please note that this talk is being recorded. And if you do have any comments, questions, or need any technical help after the webinar, please contact us on international.health@anu.edu.au. With that, I'd like to welcome our speakers for today. I'm particularly delighted with both our speakers today. I'd like to welcome Padma Shri Dr. Raman Ganga Khetkar, who is the previous head of Epidemiology and Communicable Diseases at the Indian Council of Medical Research, ICMR. He has also been a previous director of the Indian National Institute of Virology. Both these institutions were at the forefront of crafting and implementing India's COVID strategy. Dr. Ganga Khetkar is famously described as having been the face of ICMR. We were to have with us His Excellency Ambassador Mr. Manpreet Vohra in person today. However, unfortunately, he has been called away to an urgent meeting. He has, however, provided us with a video of his talk, which we will play within a few minutes. Between them, the two speakers will help us understand how India navigated the pandemic with the High Commissioner of India particularly providing an overview of the broader policy approach taken by India. So without further ado, I'll hand across to Mr. Jay Poria, who will play the video. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, namaste and good day. I'm delighted that the Australian National University here in Canberra has started this COVID-19 Peer Support Program webinar series. And I'm happy that India is a part of it today. Collectively, this exchange and the empirical evidence that we will share should help all of us and the world at large to emerge better prepared for the next similar black swan event as and when it might hit us again. I will speak broadly about the Indian experience, and then we have an eminent scientist and expert from India to give you more specific and technical details. Like for most countries, the COVID 19 pandemic for India was also unprecedented, a health catastrophe, and an enormous economic shock. Fundamental differences from many others, of course, are the geographical size and spread and the large population and population density of my country, which brought its own pressures on healthcare infrastructure and the sudden need for its rapid augmentation. No easy task, as it turned out. On the positive side, the younger demography of India, its dynamic economy, and a particularly strong pharmaceutical and vaccine sector have been welcome blessings. In many ways, therefore, we have gone through our own unique experience in India while tackling the pandemic. In this, there are certainly valuable lessons learned by India and my government, but also valuable experience and insights to be shared with others. As soon as the first confirmed COVID 19 cases were detected in India in end January and early February last year, which were some medical students who had returned from Wuhan, China, a series of steps were taken for containment and management of the pandemic were it to become one. These started with nationwide awareness campaigns with stress on COVID appropriate behavior, a system for contact tracing, isolation cases, and identification and categorization of containment zones for intensified surveillance was established should they be required. A policy making team of experts was constituted comprising virologists, epidemiologists, and healthcare professionals to devise possible COVID 19 response strategies. In March 2020, we saw an increase in the number of cases on account of some infected international visitors and a couple of super spreader events. We quickly adopted a strategy of cluster containment aimed at breaking the chain of transmission. By then, our National Institute of Virology had also isolated a strain of the coronavirus, the fifth country in the world to do so successfully. Infrastructure for coronavirus testing through rapid antigen and RT-PCR tests were ramped up in record time. Scores of pathology labs, government and private, were accredited to conduct the tests. Mobile vans were operated and makeshift testing centers at major public places were set up for maximum coverage. The cost of tests was kept low so that the common man could afford it. From 25th March last year, India was perhaps the first country to impose a very stringent national lockdown, which included closure of borders and suspension of all international flights, incoming or outgoing. Simultaneously, medical protocols for treatment of COVID 19 started being developed and quickly refined. These efforts were led by the Indian Council for Medical Research, the Council of Scientific and Industrial Research, the Indian Institute of Chemical Technology, and various drug companies. A cocktail of simple medicines, many of them repurposed, such as hydroxychloroquine, favipiravir, and ivermectin, proved quite effective. Around this time, the emergencies breaking out in parts of Europe and USA had made evident the nature and scale of the challenge and what the COVID 19 pandemic could do. The government of India, therefore, made elaborate arrangements to tide over shortages in medical infrastructure and essential supplies. Bed capacity in hospitals was expanded, and special makeshift COVID care centers were set up on a war footing, including some very large ones, such as a facility in New Delhi which could treat 10,000 patients at a time. New production lines were set up, and old companies and new startups were encouraged to make ventilators, personal protective equipment, and N95 face masks. By May 2020, we were producing about 250,000 pieces each of PPE and N95 face masks compared to almost zero before that. The government took steps to check any hoarding and black marketing of essential drugs or overcharging by private healthcare providers. The loss of livelihood for millions because of the total lockdown and its serious economic consequences was a major price that India had to bear. To help out the people, and particularly the most vulnerable, free food and cooking gas was supplied to hundreds of millions of people. Direct cash transfers were made to those who had lost their jobs and wages. Moratorium on loan repayments was accompanied by easing of credit norms. Huge economic stimuli were periodically injected into the economy by the state and federal governments. In all, these stimulus packages are worth over 700 billion US dollars. Recently, a major program of infrastructure construction valued at 1.3 trillion US dollars over the next 5 years has been started. The relatively low intensity of the first wave of the pandemic in India, which peaked in September 2020, and its successful management had surprised most observers. India was not even close to being the worst affected country that many had predicted it would be in terms of total cases and fatalities. By January and February this year, new daily cases and total caseload had dropped to such an extent that perhaps a certain complacency and overconfidence set in among all quarters in India. And then, of course, the Delta variant hit us in March, and our second wave was fearsome. It demonstrated that even the additional capacities that we had created last year were insufficient, and we needed more ICU beds, more ventilators, and more medical oxygen supplies. It was good to see the world come to our aid when we needed it most during this second wave. The assistance was generous and unhesitating from a whole host of our friends, including Australia. It helped us get through the worst, and the second wave has also now been successfully beaten back. Although it has made us the country with the second highest number of COVID-19 cases overall after the USA, our infection rate in terms of percentage of population still remains low, and at 24,000 cases per million, it is significantly lower than the global average of 30,000 per million. We may have become the third highest in absolute number of COVID-related deaths after USA and Brazil, but our mortality rate at 1.33% only is still among the lowest, while our COVID recovery rate is among the highest. Current active cases in India are just 0.81% of the total cases. The good news for everyone earlier this year was the advent of COVID-19 vaccines, and as many of you will know, in this, India is a major partner for the world because we have the largest vaccine production facilities and companies. In particular, AstraZeneca COVID-19 vaccine produced in India with the trade name of Covishield has been exported by India to almost 90 countries free of cost in many cases. Indeed, if the Gavi Alliance and the COVAX facility could start its vaccine distribution around the world, it is thanks to supplies from India. The four-country Quad group aims to deliver 1 billion doses to the world by the end of 2022, and this too is predicated to a very large extent on production out of India. Within India, 3 days ago, we crossed the milestone of administering 900 million COVID-19 vaccine doses. This has got to be the largest and fastest sustained vaccination drive anywhere. On an average, we have administered more than 7 million jabs every day in September. I'm glad that vaccination rates have improved in many parts of the world, and Australia too will hit its initial targets soon. This promises the general opening up of economies and a return of travel and travelers, possibly within weeks. For this, the mutual recognition of vaccination certificates becomes the next essential step, and I hope this will be a smooth and inclusive process rather than being restrictive. In conclusion, while there is much more that we now know about the coronavirus, the COVID-19 disease, its management, treatment, and vaccinations, the pandemic is not yet over, and there are many more efforts that will continue to be applied for a considerable more time to come. Let us not let our guard down. Let us share knowledge and experiences, and let us keep collaborating to beat back this pandemic as well as any future ones. In this long-lasting endeavor, I can assure you all that my country, India, and our scientists and experts will remain your trustworthy, transparent, and reliable partners. Thank you.
Dr. Ganga Khetkar, can I invite you to start your presentation, please? You're on, I think you're on mute, Dr. Ganga Khetkar.
Is this visible now?
Yes, it is. Thank you very much.
And am I audible?
Yep, you are.
Let me first thank the Australian National University to have invited me to give this particular talk, wherein perhaps we'll try to live through how we went through this particular pandemic. Now, we would have some reflections on the Indian response, but at the same time, before we begin, I must make a disclaimer that these are my personal views and not of any organization. We know we are battling with a smart virus, and newer evidences may change the inferences the way we tend to draw. Now, most often, when you think in terms of hindsight, in hindsight, we always appear wiser. No, before you are wise, after you are wiser, and in between you are otherwise. We continue to remain in that in-between stage rather than having a hindsight after our pandemic has ended. When one hears about this COVID in India, what is the first thing that will strike to you? It is the number of cases, which tend to be second highest. It is almost 33.9 million cases that we tend to talk about. You look at the deaths, the deaths are close to about 0.45 million. Now we need to understand, this tends to appear as if it was something which we may not have had anticipated well. But how did we respond to this pandemic? Because it may not be a complete story if we just infer from such a slide. All of us need to remember that the asymmetric warfare against SARS-CoV-2 began in 2020. We were to struggle with the virus that tends to spread through respiratory route, which is droplet and airborne kind of a virus. This virus was largely infecting people, but majority of them, predominant proportion of these people used to be those who are largely asymptomatic. And it kills those who are weak and older. Now, if you look at India, the drivers for vulnerability, which is population density, mobility and migration, and intercountry travels, perhaps were very much there to ensure that the vulnerability will be extremely high in a country like India. Now we would start reflecting on how things happened in India and how we kept on changing, because this entire process was extremely dynamic. We kept on learning and kept on changing the strategies. When it comes to these reflections, all of us remember that the New Year day of 2020, we didn't know that the world was to wake up to a new reality, which could be harsh enough. But January 11th, the first briefing that took place in India by WHO India, they briefed us that this is what is happening in China. We have heard about pneumonitis, but that was all. We didn't have much of information that was available. But by Jan 17th, the first interdepartmental meeting of related secretaries, all interrelated secretaries actually met and started talking about how we should plan against this particular infection. Now, this was one effort which we had never seen. Which at least in my life, I have worked on HIV, I worked with TB programming, I worked with hepatitis, but I had not seen such a well-coordinated response. What followed was a very comprehensive, enormous and well-coordinated and a dynamic response that tended to come out of these deliberations. Now, the first thought that people had at that juncture was, we should create capacity for testing by RT-PCR for this COVID infection, which we didn't have so much. Only one institute was there. That was ICMR's National Institute of Virology. And we decided that ICMR would go ahead and create that particular capacity. If you look at WHO declared this as a public health emergency on Jan 30th. It was the same day when we confirmed the first case that occurred in a medical student who came back from Wuhan, which the ambassador also referred to. March 11th was the date in 2020 when WHO declared this as a pandemic. Now, what happened at that juncture? If we today look at the terms that we tend to use, we can now call it a zero COVID strategy. All of us at that juncture, we thought that we need to stop this infection from coming into India. So imported cases were to be stopped to ensure that it doesn't affect India. And the reason why it was being thought as an important issue, important approach per se, because SARS, MERS, we fought with the same kind of strategy at that juncture, and we were fairly successful. Taiwan, South Korea, and Japan and China, from wherever this information was coming, it was appearing that zero COVID strategy would perhaps be the best strategy to undertake. So you have a stricter lockdown as early as possible, extensive testing to offer, go for contact tracing very aggressively, isolate those who are found as infected, and closed or controlled borders was the solution that was thought of. Now, some of the actions that we undertook at that juncture was to prevent the incoming imported cases per se. What was it that was done? At that juncture, though, in the first phase, those countries that were reporting these new infections in larger numbers, like China, Iran, Italy, Japan, and South Korea, any foreign national who had traveled to these countries, the visa was declared as invalid. all Indian visas that were issued to nationals of any country prior to March 13th, they were not allowed to come in the country. India banned all international flights subsequently on March 22nd, and after the lockdown was announced by the Prime Minister, all the domestic flights were banned from March 24, 2020. But at the same time, one must understand the issues that tend to arise when you try to stop those who are coming from international by international flights from other countries. Indian citizens would always have a right to come back to their own country. Now that was found to be very difficult to stop. So different rescue missions were also the ones that were undertaken. From Wuhan, we evacuated close to about 654 people. From China and Japan, we similarly did evacuate about 236 people. There were many people who had gone to Iran for religious reasons, especially from Jammu Kashmir. And then it was very difficult because Iran was facing a tough challenge at that juncture and a very strong kind of outbreak there. So we had to even establish a laboratory and try to rescue those people from Iran to come back to our own country. And this happened in March, on March 3rd. The lessons that we learned: leaks are leaks. No? In no time, they can become extremely large. So you need to be cautious. Now you look at the backdrop at which the Indian health system is and what exactly tends to happen. All of us know that we have close to about 28 states in India, and additionally about 8 odd union territories. Health by constitution is a state subject. Now, since it is a state subject, every state would perhaps decide its own policies. When it comes to health, there was another larger issue that private sector is also involved, perhaps more popular in provision of health services when it comes to comparison with the public sector per se. There are uniform policies were required. They were extremely critical to handle this particular pandemic. So what was it? That was the first action that was taken. National Disaster Management Act of 2005, that was evoked on March 24th when the lockdown was announced. Now that made it possible that the Prime Minister became the chair of the National Disaster Management Authority. So the differences that could have had existed with respect to policies between states were smoothened out. There was one person, one central handling that was happening with respect to COVID-19, and that was extremely important for us. What was also important, which we need to recognize, is private sector is one where you tend to pay for the services that you tend to get from these private hospitals. Now, one of the issues was that if private sector has to be roped in, because this was a pandemic, you wanted to have larger number of beds, you also needed to have the support coming from private sector. This National Disaster Management Act actually gave us some kind of a leverage, and it was also told by the government that what you need to do is the public sector, if it is required, the government might say that in a given area, the private hospitals would also be acquired by the government for the time being, and they will perhaps help us rolling out the health services per se. If you look at the lockdown, the lockdown as it happened in different phases, did we start very early with lockdown? Yes, of course we did. If you look at March 24th, the total number of people who were found to be infected, that's a cumulative number of 562, and the number of deaths were only 9. But then, as time passed by, there were extensions to the lockdown that were given. You found that these numbers kept on increasing, but still they were very much in control. And one of the things which perhaps we need to remember is that was a time when the lockdown started. It was very difficult because everything had stopped, the transportation had stopped. And when you establish laboratories, and try to provide kits to them to undertake testing, one of the biggest challenges was how do you deliver it across the country? And therefore, a mission Udan was also started because the domestic flights had stopped. The Indian Air Force, the Indian Post, Indian Railways, and ICMR both worked together, all of them worked together for kit transport from March 26, 2020. It was a huge operation that one just needs to imagine, because even those flights used to be full with the kits that were going across in different centers. Our laboratories, by and large, tend to have an unutilized capacity, and they actually demonstrated that they can rise to this particular occasion. If you look at January 21st, the first RT-PCR was done in ICMR NIV, and at that juncture, the global cases, the total load of COVID infection that was reported as confirmed was 314. When it comes to Jan 28, that's 1 week later, we had conducted only about 22 tests and the frequency was 4 to 6 per day. The first case occurred on 30th of Jan, when the total number across in the world that was reported was close to about 8,000, and only 82 out of them were from 18 countries other than China. So essentially they had just started. So we also started pretty quickly and detected those cases. Not only did we detect that, when we started spreading our network of testing laboratories, QA/QC, that is quality assurance and quality control, was started on April 5th. And we adopted a different hub-spoke kind of a model where regional mentor labs were established on April 12th, so that perhaps that would facilitate the training or troubleshooting that was also required. Everything, when it comes to creation of this lab infrastructure, was being done virtually, which was a unique experience in itself, which had never been tried as much prior to COVID. Now today, so far we have conducted over 575 million tests. Over 2 million tests have been done in a day as a record. 2,980 labs are there, of which almost 1,300 labs are from the government sector, and that's an achievement in itself. If you look at the number of labs that we trained and validated for COVID testing, one issue that we must remember, all the labs that we picked up were those which had an accreditation given by one agency which we call as a NABL. Unless they had that, we never allowed these tests to be done to them. And if you look at this particular graph, from Jan 20, where we had only one lab of ICMR NIV, by the time the lockdown was lifted in May 2020, we had close to about 669 laboratories which were accredited, which were trained, and they could do their own testing. And the numbers kept on increasing even after lockdown. And today you have these tests which are available almost in every possible corner, because there could be collection centers where people could give their samples, and then that also could be tested across in the country. So it was a very massive kind of operation that we had. Now, if you look at the milestones, as we said earlier, we moved from one lab. We talked about 30th of sometime around 27th or 28th. We had conducted. We had only 22 tests that were done at ICMR NIV until that particular period. But if you look at the progress that happened subsequently, by August 2020, there were 1 million tests, cumulative RT-PCR tests that were done. The number suddenly jumped within a period of about 2 months to 100 million. And then by February 21, it was 200. And then May 2021, it went up to 300 million tests that have been done so far in the past. So it was a huge scale up that had occurred. But it sounds very easy. It sounds as if it was possible. We just established labs and we could move ahead. But was this the reality? Perhaps not. The entire world in the months of February and March was grappling with a reality that there is a huge shortage of RT-PCR kits, the machines, the reagents and swabs and VTM, you name whatever you wanted to. You look at the manufacturing capacity that we had in the pre-COVID era, all the RT-PCR kits were imported in India for COVID. Rapid diagnostic tests were not available in India. RNA extraction kits were not there. VTM and swabs, we didn't have that manufacturing capacity. But you look at the achievement, by August 2020, you suddenly find that close to about 1470 million RT-PCR kits could be produced in India in terms of the manufacturing capacity. You look at rapid diagnostic test, it was close to about 48 million. We had to also have RNA extraction kits because those were becoming very difficult to procure even from global market. So we had about 262 millions, which we could actually provide as a capacity. VTMs, the viral transport media, that was also, we tried to create a large supply base so that we don't end up into problem. All of you must be knowing the swabs used to be specialized, and the swabs at that juncture were not becoming available. So we had to create our own swabs, ensure that they have an adequate quality, and the capacity was large enough. And that's how we started fighting with this particular infection. But was it that it was only an issue related to diagnostics? Perhaps not. Our Prime Minister had given Atmanirbhar call for India. Atmanirbhar essentially means we become self-reliant. And if you look at the fact, now when it came to N95 masks, we hardly had any capacity to produce N95 masks. And at that juncture, if you recall, N95 masks were in huge shortage at that juncture. And we didn't know, if you don't have N95 masks, then how the healthcare workers are going to work in the hospitals and try to protect themselves. You look at surgical masks, you look at gloves, you look at even PPE. PPE was hardly produced in India. You look at the goggles, they were never produced as much in India. You look at ventilators, the capacity to produce itself was very, very low. But the efforts started off, all the industry players were called, and they were asked to produce more in terms of these different products. And the result was, during this COVID period, we became not only self-sufficient, but in certain areas, we started exporting these products across to the country. And we are now currently considered as second largest manufacturers of PPE and the supplies that you are seeing in this particular slide. Now, when you do all this, there was another task that we had to worry about: supply. Even if you provide supplies, now you have to train the healthcare infrastructure. Now, how could we do that? We also need to have larger base of healthcare infrastructure. The number of hospital beds should be huge, which was not there because this is a rapidly spreading virus, and we knew that when it would move around almost like a wildfire. A total of about 15,000 odd COVID treatment facilities were created. About 1.2 million dedicated isolation beds without oxygen were also created as temporary facilities. About 0.2 million oxygen supported isolation beds were created, and close to about 81,000 ICU beds and 40,000 ventilator beds were created within a very short span of time. A total number of the quarantine centers was increased to about 12,669, and they had almost 600,000 beds that were placed in these quarantine centers. And all this, once it happened, you had to train the manpower. So telemedicine was used as a media to try and train and also go for troubleshooting during patient management. It didn't only stop at that. we had to even think of other diseases because other diseases are also as common. And the result was we were worried because of lockdown, people will not be able to access healthcare so easily. And therefore, eSanjeevani, National Teleconsultation Center and eSanjeevani program was also started for non-COVID patient. And in order to create an enabling environment where the healthcare workers don't get worried or concerned that they might acquire the infection and perhaps it could impact their services. Now, insurance cover of $68,000 was declared by the Prime Minister for on account of if somebody dies due to COVID infection while providing the healthcare or even acting on their own duties as such. It is extremely difficult to imagine what would have had happened if this was not done. We utilized the time effectively to gear up and meet the challenge of this pandemic. And that's why perhaps we had a better time during compared to the second wave. We were better off in the first wave per se. Now, if you look at lockdown, there is one issue that we have to remember that when you go for a lockdown, non-pharmacological interventions are going to ensure that health outcomes could have been improved because morbidity and mortality was perhaps influenced by the same. But the economic impact was another issue that was a major botheration. But the situation actually demanded that lockdown had to be taken in terms of improving the health outcome. In order to ensure that people don't suffer, COVID relief was also provided by providing financial relief to people, food support that was given. There was a call which our Prime Minister gave to not to cut the salaries of people who are unable to come for work, and they should not be removed by the employer from their own jobs. And also, people should not be thrown out of their houses even if they are unable to pay the rent. So all kinds of efforts were made at the governmental level. Now, if you look at the drugs that we had, this entire saga, if we were to describe, it is a saga of dropping ineffective drugs against COVID-19. Initially, we started with boosted lopinavir, ivermectin. The list tends to go long. And there were non-specific drugs like vitamin C, vitamin D, and zinc, which were used by people. But one after another, those drugs were dropped. But there was a distinct advantage that the delayed onset of this first wave that provided to us. By June 16th, we came to know that dexamethasone can be a good drug to use. And that made a huge impact because even today, the use of dexamethasone continues to provide an edge in terms of reducing mortality among patients who require oxygen. Now, when it comes to the drugs that were found to be ones which should not be used, you find hydroxychloroquine, lopinavir, interferon beta. These three drugs were found to be not so useful. We participated in the solidarity trial that WHO had taken, and essentially these drugs went out of favor. And when it came to convalescent plasma, India provided the largest studies, randomized control trials data at that juncture, which showed that convalescent plasma was not useful. However, we must also remember that people, since there were no drugs that were available, they despite the fact that the evidence suggested that this is not going to help the patients at all, convalescent plasma continued to be used, but not in the large way in which it was done earlier. Now, since the delayed onset of the first wave that occurred, that was seen in India, and that was something which enabled people to use right kind of drugs, especially dexamethasone at the right time. You find that one of the studies that was published in Nature from Ramanan's group, it found that the risk of death, if you compare it by period of testing, it kept on declining if you take the reference point as 1 between March and April 30th, you find that if you look at July to August, you will find that it was declining and it went into, it was reduced to a significant proportion. Now, one of the things that people tended to worry about, if these death rates were declining, what does it essentially mean? Perhaps the lockdown provided us an opportunity whereby we could apply the learnings that the world was actually experiencing and coming out with publications in an appropriate manner, and we could ensure that the proportion that tends to die could be reduced to a larger extent. It could also be that this may be a reflection of delayed reporting that tends to occur as far as deaths are concerned, and the underreporting that may also be there. It is reported by some that the underreporting may be as high as almost 7 to 9 times higher, but we still don't have an evidence to say that that was absolutely whatever we had reported was a huge underreporting. But excess mortality is claimed based on different modeling exercises that people have done, that underreporting may have happened. But at the same time, one must also remember that we have less proportion of elderlies compared to rest of the developed world, and therefore our numbers may have been different when it comes to deaths. And how different they were, if you look at the first wave itself, in the first wave, if you look at the countries and their death rates as are reported, you find that the first ones that actually had this pandemic intensifying in their own countries, you find Italy, Spain, UK, Argentina, where the intensity of this outbreak was very high while we were in a stage of lockdown. They had very high death rates compared to what you find in India. India is only second from the bottom at this juncture, and that may perhaps be due to the delayed onset. Now, it's not only related to drugs, but at the same time, we had to take certain steps whereby we ensure that we will be able to launch a comprehensive response. The first thing that was done was we tried to intensify our efforts to culture coronavirus. And on March 13th, we managed to culture this particular coronavirus. We must remember that we had not earlier cultured coronaviruses. And that was a big issue because we wanted to ensure that once you culture, we could go for developing different products per se as a country. The IgG ELISA was developed by NIV on May 10th, 2020. We shared this virus, we shared the technology with Zydus Cadila, one of the pharmaceutical companies, on the same day in order to ensure that we don't run out of diagnostics. We shared this particular virus also with Bharat Biotech, the one which has produced Covaxin, and their phase 1 trial started in July 2020, and all of us know Covishield and Covaxin. Covishield is a product that was originally developed by AstraZeneca, Oxford, and Covaxin is an inactivated whole virus vaccine that was developed by Bharat Biotech in collaboration with ICMR. These received emergency use authorization on January 3rd, 2021. Vaccine rollout started beginning sometime around January 16th on 2021. Now, if you look at what could have happened, when we said the first wave tended to end sometime around January 2021, if you look at the graphs now retrospectively, what do you find? We had almost 2.5 months of time when the infection was perhaps at a very low end, only about 8,000 odd cases were occurring every day at that particular juncture. But one of the lessons, if you actually look back and think what perhaps we could have done, when the infections tend to decline, whether it is policymakers, whether it is people, whether it is healthcare workers, we tend to forget about that particular infection. We should intensify efforts to saturate the population when the infections tend to decline, with comprehensive interventions, with starting from testing, contact tracing, isolation and management, even if there are a small number of cases that may be occurring at that juncture, that's how we would be able to eliminate such an infection. At that particular juncture, perhaps this was not coming to the minds of people at large, the healthcare fraternity, mainly because there was a news item that used to come out. There were publications that were suggesting that the vaccines have already been developed, which usually used to require about 10 to 15 years time. But not only are they developed, they were also effective, especially the Moderna and Pfizer. And then that gave some kind of confidence to everybody that perhaps we'll be able to deal with this particular COVID pandemic really well. But when you roll out vaccines in a very short period of time, what would happen? You essentially find that it could lead to vaccine eagerness or vaccine hesitancy. And this essentially, the two spectrums of this issue tend to depend on risk perception and understanding the efficacy of that particular vaccine, as well as adverse events that tend to be associated with these vaccines, and the very fact that we didn't have sufficient information on adverse events, and even the vaccine efficacy figures were at a very early time points, and therefore we didn't have much of this information to be relied upon. It was only left to the people to decide whether they would like to fall in the eagerness category or hesitancy. But both tend to pose challenges in vaccine rollout. At that time, in December, there was a survey that was done. The Ipsos poll was done. There, even India had figured in, along with US, China, and Japan. And what did they find in terms of the reasons why people may not take COVID vaccine? In India, it was mostly side effects. And that actually led to a lot of impact, because at that juncture, when the vaccines were approved on Jan 3rd, the data from phase 3 trials was not available. And despite that, in order to meet that particular challenge, the government decided to move in and provide vaccine. And that created a fear of these side effects dramatically. If you look at the story, 2021 January, and what do you find? India was at a very, if you compare with other countries, India had a smaller peak. And when it came to the first wave, what was it that we actually saw? That the outbreak intensified sometime in the month of July. And then by January end, the outbreak had come down. So essentially, it took about 5 to 6 months time to come down to the lowest value at that juncture. Now, at that time, when things were happening, there was simultaneously, when the cases start declining, the complacency sets in. People start looking at, why should I be using these COVID appropriate behaviors? Because they are difficult to practice. If you look at the differences that become apparent now when you look at it retrospectively, the daily new infections that were there, that was recorded at the peak in the first wave, was almost around 97,000. It came down to 8,700. You look at the deaths, that which is important for influencing people's thinking, it came down from 2,300 to almost 180 deaths that would occur every day. If you look at the hospital beds, another queue over which people could have had thought that they need to adhere to COVID appropriate behavior, you find that the beds were vacant largely. The ICU beds, they were also vacant in a large proportion. When it comes to mechanical ventilators, you look at the figure in September, it was 116,000, whereas you look at 7,500 as a figure on mechanical ventilation in February 20. So people, suddenly started thinking that why should I be as much worried? And that was a time when festivals and even elections were slated to happen. And naturally, what would happen? The infection would increase dramatically. But what was worrisome at that juncture? If you look at the number of tests, they had also dropped from the peak value by almost 40%. That were being done every day, the tests that were being done every day. If you look at mask use, it had dropped by 10% and it had gone to about 61% universal mask use in March, in the month of March in 2021. If you look at the cell phone mobility, which is actually a measure, are people moving out into the society, you find that it had dropped down to minus 16%, which was way higher. And that was a fertile ground for the COVID to strike back. And this was essentially seen for the first time on 18th of February 2021. If you look at this graph, you will suddenly find in Maharashtra, in certain pockets, especially this was in the Vidarbha region, you find there was an increase, small increase that was becoming noticeable. And the result is very clear. You suddenly find that there was a second wave, and the second wave was extremely rapid. It took everybody by complete surprise. And on a particular day, there were close to about 400 odd thousand people who were detected as infected. Now that was a massive increase. But you look at the feature of this particular wave as well. If you see, the peak did not last longer in the second wave compared to what you see in the first wave. Now, one of the issues that we have to remember why such a thing tended to happen. We had established a genomic surveillance. We started it in 35 select labs in April 2020. About 4,000 odd samples were sequenced, and there was only one sample where D614G mutation was detected, and this was almost about 6 months after initiating this particular activity. And this mutation was also being reported in other countries as well. And at that juncture, people thought that this is just a variation. It just doesn't add any fitness, any increased fitness to this particular virus. So there's nothing much to worry. In December 2020, Indian government launched what is called as Indian SARS-CoV-2 Genome Sequencing Consortia. These are different institutions which are networking across in India and doing genomic sequencing. And when one of the labs that was based in Pune, that particular lab detected the B1.167 variant on March 12th. And then the story is very well known across the world that the variant actually affected all of us. It was known subsequently as Delta variant. So far, we have done 65,000 genomes have been sequenced so far. And at this juncture, there are no new variants that have been detected for the last so many months into the second wave. If you look at this Delta upsurge, you will find that the colors tend to reflect to you the Delta variant, and you will find that from Jan, when Delta was detected, you will find that it became a predominant infecting virus, and it went right up to 100% of all those samples that were getting collected at that juncture. And it was Delta, a strain that a virus that was viral variant that replaced all other strains. And Delta, all of us know, is associated with very high risk of transmission efficiency. It increases transmission efficiency. It reduces incubation period. It is associated with higher viral loads. And the entire picture changed. It was subsequently what was actually being visible was in the first wave, people used to have one case occurring in a family and things used to be stopped at that particular juncture. But here, when people used to come for testing, an entire family used to be found as infected because this was this was a rapidly spreading variant, and it had it had a high transmission efficiency, and the results were essentially seen. When we, in order to gauge how what proportion of people in the country have been infected by this virus, we conducted 4 national sero surveys so far in India. The first one was done in May-June 2020. Then when it was found that the proportion that was found to be having antibodies was 0.73%. This increased by almost 10 folds by August, September 20. And then when we did this in December, when the first wave had almost declined, it was found to be 24%, which was almost 3.5 times higher. And when we repeated this in the month of June, when the second wave had actually started hitting us, we found that this proportion had jumped to close to about 68%. That is almost 2 out of 3 persons in India who were more than 10 years old were found to be infected in that sample. And the sample is huge. It was a massive kind of a survey that was done in 70 different clusters per se. In this 4th national sero survey, since the vaccination rollout had started, it was found that almost 62% of those who participated in survey, they reported that they had not taken the vaccine so far, which essentially means these figures more or less tended to show what was the magnitude of spread that had occurred in the community by then. Did we learn much from the first wave? Yes, we did. The first wave and part of second wave tended to teach us a lot when it comes to now not zero COVID strategy, but living with the virus as one of the strategies. If you look at the number of tests that had to be done to detect a new confirmed case, this was a departure from the first wave, where at the end of the first wave, the testing numbers had dropped down dramatically. Here, if you look at the third violet colored line, you will find that the number of tests that were done for every new confirmed case was considerably higher even compared to other countries, which essentially meant that during this second wave, we did not let our guard go down. We continued to keep on testing more and more among our people. Now, there was another learning lesson that we had. As we looked at this seesaw, where health outcomes and economic impact have to be balanced, one thing which we realized is if we are now going to live with this particular virus, we should be in a position to create this as an adjustable seesaw. So you tend to have a decentralized approach as one of the most important issues rather than national decision making, that there would be a lockdown and every state tends to follow. The entire decision making was left to the states at this particular point in time. Then it was mostly a calibrated response where containment zones were created. Then subsequently micro containment zones, like even the apartments used to be the unit which used to be closed down rather than the entire area where the apartment was located, or the entire city or a village where it was located. No, and then CCC based, that is these people who were found to be infected, if they wanted to shift, no, that they could not have had a safe distance maintained in their households because of the population density in those areas, or in the slums, the per capita space would be pretty low. So what would you do? A CCC based isolation facilities were created, temporary facilities where these people used to be shifted, and this used to ensure that the infection doesn't travel as much into the community. And livelihood support program was also given due importance. The reason this was most important was, if in most of the families, if you find that 1 or 2 members who were wage earners, if they get admitted or they get isolated, the entire family would find it difficult to ensure that the ration reaches their home. The family will have some kind of access. For 5 days, Even they used to get isolated, so they can't move out of their households, and then how do you run their kitchens? So livelihood support program was also prioritized in different parts of the country, and that helped a lot in gaining confidence of the community that you should come out and tell your symptoms and get yourself tested. This was without any charge that was levied to people, but this is not going to make it the life difficult for their family members. This would in fact ensure that the family members would remain safe, and the government would take care. The NGOs, the non-governmental organizations would take care of the livelihood support of others. Now, if you look at how we have done when it comes to use of masks in India, you will suddenly find that in the first wave, if you look at this map, we were wearing masks. Almost all of us were wearing masks. It was a universal use of mask, which was very high compared to majority of the parts of the world. But this happened because this disease was new. Prime Minister, who is a very popular figure, had issued a call that they need to use mask, and the difference was seen. But when we started living, we started deciding that perhaps now we have to look at the economic impact as well. You find that we have to look at the mobility as the most important factor, because your economic impact gets worsened if you reduce the mobility to a larger extent. As long as they wear masks, that would be considered as right, and you started opening up the entire system at that juncture. You find that as of now the mobility is so high, it's almost coming closer to what was there during pre-COVID time. You will also find universal mask use has dropped as of now compared to the second wave when it was at the peak. But at the same time, this continues to be higher than what would otherwise be seen elsewhere. Now, while doing all this, it was syringes and needles could have had made a huge difference. When it comes to rolling out vaccines to 1/6 of the population in the world, these become extremely important, especially at the backdrop that you have 2-dose vaccines which are available. India used to be importing 50% of auto-disabled vaccines from China before COVID struck us. The estimated need for syringes for COVID vaccination to 2/3 of the population was almost around 1.8 billion pieces that we required. There were only 3 major manufacturers. These manufacturers decided to create additional capacity. And today, if you look at one issue, 240 million pieces of these vaccines have been already supplied to COVAX by December 2020. And there is a new scale-up demand that is also being met with increased capacity of 1 billion syringes to be produced between September to December 21, and that too the low dead space syringe, which perhaps reduces vaccine wastage to a larger extent. So that was something which was crucial for vaccine rollout. Now, where are we? If you look at as a country and number of dosages that have been provided, we stand number 1. But when it comes to that, there are certain issues that we have to remember. The proportion of people who are protected continues to be smaller. We are coming close to about 50% with single dose at this juncture. Currently, we have administered close to 921 million dosages of vaccine, and these dosages are being provided through 51,000 healthcare facilities from where this is happening across in India. What is also important is that gender inequity, which used to be a talking point, is also getting reduced to a larger extent. The proportion is 52 to 48 as of now, which will become lower. If you look at our performance, in the last 1 month's time, you find that we are almost able to maintain the rate of vaccination close to about 6 to 6.5 million per day. What is also important is people tend to ask a question, now when will we complete our own vaccination? The government of India is committed to vaccinate by December 2021. Now, would that be possible? Because if you calculate this way, you will come up with a figure that we may require about 4 to 6 months time if you are giving it to only about 6 million, 6.5 million every day. But there is one thing which we have to remember. There were supplies constraints that were there. They have been overcome to a larger extent by increasing the capacity, even among vaccine manufacturers. There are newer vaccines that are also going to come from different manufacturers. By the end of October, perhaps you will find that the market would be flooded with different types of vaccine and the dosages that would be available. And what is important to remember is in this particular month, we could provide almost 2 crores is what 25 million vaccine dosages in a given day. So you have a huge healthcare infrastructure. You can deliver it. The question is, once it becomes available, we see this goal as a feasible goal at this juncture. At the same time, the government is also making efforts to reach the hard to reach population. The drone launched vaccine delivery system has also been launched in the northeastern part, where in Manipur and Nagaland, where distances and access to healthcare system continues to be a major challenge. And there you find that even if you have to travel about 20 to 30 kilometers, it would take close to about 4 hours to travel by road if you want to. Drones are being tested, and the first effort was done only about a couple of days or 3 days back, which will cover even the difficult areas, difficult to reach areas in the country. Now, whenever you do such a intervention, what is most important is you continue to rely on non-pharmacological interventions, which are very difficult to sustain. So you need to have high level of community engagement. You need to have a peer-led or CPOL model and behavior change communication, and try to implement it through either community-based organizations or non-governmental organizations. But community engagement and mobilization becomes a major challenge in a rapidly evolving pandemic, which tends to spread extremely fast. Now, that can become a major challenge in preparing the community. So how was it tackled? The communities were mobilized by the political leadership as well. Now, our Prime Minister came out with different slogans which were popularized across, and people respect him, people started following them. The first one was, we said that until the time a medicine is discovered, you can't be complacent with COVID appropriate behavior. Then once vaccine was discovered, where vaccines were given emergency use authorization, it also said that you may use this vaccine, but you need to continue to adhere the COVID appropriate behavior. And what is also important is, after some time on May 21st, 2021, he also came out with one more slogan that tends to say that people will receive COVID-19 treatment even at patient's doorstep if it is required to reduce the burden on health system per se. Now, what was the impact on other diseases? If you actually look at HIV disease, was the first disease, which is a chronic persistent infection which requires a lifelong treatment. That was the first one where free treatment is offered by the government across. Now, since free antiretroviral therapy is provided, did it impact that? It did not, because the peer networks, the community mobilization in HIV programming was so strong that the peer network was mobilized during lockdown. And you see the fact that they were not only distributing medicines to those who were required because they were in a network. You also found that even the ration was also provided to them through these networks per se. When it came to vaccine hesitancy, one of the strategies that was adopted was to ensure that everyone can see oneself as a celebrity, and they took different shots, the selfie shots, and tried to influence their own friends who were and relatives in the surrounding. What was also important is these sites, which were also horrible sites that we saw in the second wave, actually led to people coming out to take vaccine, reduce the vaccine hesitancy to a larger extent. But at the same time, we also understood that involvement of communities is critical. And in order to ensure that they tend to follow the COVID appropriate behavior, we have to make them responsible for self, their own family. Their safety depends on others' safety. What is also important for us now, there is a glimpse of hope that is coming. So far, our pharmaceutical industry, which is one of the strongest in the world, when it came to remdesivir, 7 Indian companies entered into voluntary licensing with Gilead Science, the original manufacturer, and provided it to 127 low and middle income countries. Now a new hope has come with molnupiravir, one of the new drugs which has been found to be effective, and it reduces the risk of hospitalization by 50%. It's an oral drug. Now, Merck has the API for Merck globally is provided by one of the firms which is a API producer in India. And then 5 Indian companies have taken a voluntary license for the same, and they will be providing this particular drug in more than 100 countries. On top of it, if COVID can be contained to a larger extent, economy is also showing its own signs of improvement. Yesterday only, Moody's upgraded India's rating to stable from negative. The tax collections are also improving on month, and GDP is also predicted to improve rapidly in a short period of time. So both the health outcomes as well as the economic impact appears to be improving at this juncture. Still, the schools are in a phase of opening out in different states. What we would like to see is this hope transforms into reality, and those children who are unable to go to school, play in the gardens, perhaps would be able to move out and do things. We learned a lot. There's only one thing which I can say. Since we have one of the largest countries, second largest in terms of population, and a huge geographical area, perhaps the steps that we undertook through lockdown were so important to ramp up our response to this pandemic. If that would not have had been there, if there was no significant intersectoral coordination that the way we have observed in this outbreak, if it was not there, we don't know where we would be. But it's a hope that the collective action will make a difference and will continue to foster the strategies towards healthy India and prosperous India. Thank you.
Thank you for that excellent presentation, Dr. Gangakhetkar. I think it's probably one of the best policy lectures I've heard in a while. We do have a lot of questions. Is it okay if I read them out to you?
Yeah, please do. First, should I take out my slides?
Yes, please, if you'd like to. You can stop sharing your screen.
Yeah. Now you can ask.
The questions we've got is on Indian citizens who have been allowed to enter back from overseas. The question is, how were they quarantined and who invested for those facilities?
No, initially, if I recall correctly, we had created facilities where Army the BSF, Border Security Force, the police force, they were manning the places where they used to come and were asked to go for a quarantine of 2 weeks. Now that was okay until the time the numbers were small. Unfortunately, even when it comes to international travelers, our numbers tend to continue to be high. So over a period of time, we had to relax that and say that you would perhaps stay at home and you would be watched by the public health department. No, they would make visits to you or call you. So everyday calls were made and symptoms, no, whether they are there or not, was an effort that people tried to make. But it was a challenging task. Uh, there was no other way out. You can't, because it's too big a country and every number tends to be so big that it becomes very difficult to handle if it comes as an unplanned thing like the pandemic came.
Absolutely. So you mentioned in the initial part of your talk that the Disaster Management Act had been put in place. One of the questions we've got is, has that now been stepped down or is it still active?
No, it is still there, but when it comes to, see, you will have Disaster Management Act, no, which gives some control to the center. But what the center now says is, I will have decentralized policies in certain directions, no? Whether it is opening of schools, when it comes to opening of temples or religious congregations, or banning mass gatherings for election, all that has been given to the states. It has not been completely withdrawn. I think we need to appreciate one fact that though we keep on feeling happy that our numbers are small, we need to be watchful. We still think second wave, no, is still not gone until the time the numbers drop down dramatically and touch towards the baseline. So we'll still need NDMA. And NDMA, I can understand why the person may be asking this question, because NDMA reduces people's participation. But essentially what will happen, no, if you have seen the alternate ways that we adopted in the initial part when we went for a lockdown, that is the only model that can be offered, no? We have to be transparent, we have to teach science to people. Beyond that, the pandemic never gave us any opportunity to do that. You have to imagine that a country where the scientific literacy tends to be low, we had a humongous task of teaching how to prevent COVID infection and adhere to those preventive practices to a population size which is 1350 million people. Anybody could do something wrong and there is nothing that you could do. But I think if you look at all kinds of models that are available for community engagement, there is none that you could have adopted during COVID time. It is just using opinion leaders, asking everybody to become their own peer leader and not, even actively intervening. It's just appealing to them and being truthful, take them together to say during press briefing, this is what I understand, this is what I don't understand. But you have to keep on following this. And people respected that. I think we did very well as a large country, despite the fact that we are otherwise a difficult country to rule if you think of democracy, because each one of us could have diverse views, but nothing happened.
No, I think the logistics are mind-boggling. So absolutely. Another question we have is, sir, what test do you use, the RT-PCR or the NAAT?
No, both the tests can be used. What we say is, RT-PCR is a gold standard. It requires at least 12 hours turnaround time, because you are going to collect, then it goes to a lab, they will put it up in batches. So things tend to, you add to the turnaround time, but it is a gold standard. So what we say is if you are expected to find out whether the person is infected or not quickly, no, whether it is for clinical suspicion or whatever, no, what you do is you could do rapid antigen test first. If the test comes out as positive, then you don't need to worry. The person should be treated as positive and dealt with accordingly. If the person is symptomatic and he comes out as negative, then you do RT-PCR. That is a classical kind of a guideline that we have. But of late, RT-PCRs are being increasingly done because that duration of turnaround time is getting reduced. The cost of RT-PCR kit that we offer to the every state government has come down to less than about 100 odd rupees, 100 rupees, which is far more cheaper than, if I can recall, in the early period, we had put a cap of 4,500 rupees. So this is hardly anything. So people are adopting use of RT-PCR more often now.
We have another very interesting question. Can you comment on the potential environmental cost of COVID, particularly in relation to PPE disposal? Does India have any policy on that?
Unfortunately, I don't know whether other countries have that kind of policy. We never had the time to think about that issue when the intensity of the outbreak was pretty severe here. But I understand people are talking in terms of, how can we reuse, how can we decontaminate. Disposal is becoming a bigger issue. But I must admit that there is currently, at least I have not come across any document which says that this should be our policy. But at the same time, I'm still hopeful that in another 3-4 months' time, perhaps our position will be better. We may not have to use PPEs as much as we think.
Another short question. Do you think further mutation may risk another wave in India?
Now, this is completely personal opinion, because nobody should hold anybody responsible except my own tongue. And I venture into wrong area. If you ask me, I think, Delta variant is perhaps the most fit variant we have seen so far. That is the reason you find Delta as becoming predominant variant across in the world. Everywhere the figure is more than 80% to 95, 96% as one that is actually getting sequenced everywhere. Now, second issue is, does this mean there are no new variants coming? We hear a lot, no? We first heard mu, then we heard lambda, then we heard about C.1.2. But let me put it this way. The rate of mutation in these variants is so high that it goes against the tenets of fitness. No? If a virus becomes fit, there is no reason for the virus to keep on mutating every time. No? So it actually is a pointer that it doesn't consider itself fit. See, if a fitter progeny should no longer want to change. No. The third thing which is important is the number of sites where the mutation can increase transmission efficiency. To my mind, they are far lesser than what we imagine. So those sites are already mutated to a considerable extent. Now, would a new variant come? One thing which we have to realize is, a calamity can occur. There is no this thing because it is unpredictable. But the reality of life is, this particular Delta variant is associated with 2 days of incubation period. Now, if it becomes 1 day incubation period, for the virus, and then decide I can move very rapidly, it would not be so easy to develop such a variant, because that in itself is also going to be counterproductive for the virus, because viruses survival is also finite. The moment it becomes symptomatic, your immune system is going to start attacking it, however good or bad. So it is also a threat to the virus survival, duration of survival. So to my mind, I would be reasonably, I would put my bet as a reasonable bet that more than Delta variant, perhaps we won't see any variant. The fears that you see across are only because the people are reporting new infections at a time, daily occurrence of new or incidence of new infection. Now that is being reported because they are testing people like that. If I vaccinate everybody, if my vaccine is not going to protect you from acquiring new infection, but protect only against development of severe COVID disease or otherwise, you are already into risk mitigation stage. As long as the person doesn't get admitted, the person doesn't die, we should be comfortable. So who should you be testing in order to know how big is this problem now? Is perhaps only those who get hospitalized, rather than testing all those who might have those minor symptoms of cough and cold and fever, which could occur, but they are not going to affect the person as much.
Thank you. That was a very reassuring answer. We have another question here. India, like Australia and many other countries across the world, has both public and private health systems. How did India regulate particularly polytherapy in the private sector? It's an amazingly difficult thing to do, but did you have any perspectives on that?
No, I think regulations can be difficult if the masters are different. Their masters are too many when it comes to private setup. Each one of them who funds that hospital could be their master, and the policies could be decided. How do we regulate that? I think in terms of regulation, what is important to keep in mind is to be progressive. You try and ensure, plead with them about rational treatment, and simultaneously you try to generate demand for rational treatment in the community. When both things happen, it becomes very difficult to deviate from that. I know that this takes a long time. It's not only COVID specific issue. This is a issue that tends to exist over a period of time. But if you try to regulate them more, the reaction could be worse. Perhaps the most prudent step that one can take is to develop different guidelines, ask them to follow, and at the same time you are also finding insurance, health insurance is increasing in India. The coverage is also increasing. So you have another partner with you who's not going to pay that individual if that hospital doesn't treat him properly. So things are evolving, though they are very challenging to handle.
We have a question on contact tracing. How did you manage contact tracing, especially in rural towns?
That was actually, urban areas was a problem, not rural areas. The reason is, we, even at the level of the villages, we have ASHA as a voluntary health worker, the accredited health worker. No? She is part of the system. Now, if she is at a village level, she looks after, let's say, about 3 or 4 villages, and it becomes much more easy for her to take care of her own small population. But actually what COVID has shown us is something which makes you think, how will you augment urban healthcare infrastructure, especially related to public health. Rural was far too, because the numbers used to be, and you have to remember the population density is low there. Their numbers are going to be small. The likelihood of exposure also becomes low, because if you are sparsely distributed, you will mix with only those who are staying close by. So that bubble is always well maintained. No? Unless you are traveling out of the village, you have a high mobility around in the peri-urban area, it was not a big problem. But personally speaking, I think urban areas posed more challenges than rural in contact tracing.
There's a question on schools operating during the first and the second wave, and what you will recommend if we are to live with the virus moving forward. I understand schools are starting to open up there.
Just now. No, they are starting just now. There are 2 things which we would definitely see. There has to be a decentralized approach to open up schools, and it should go by districts. No, districts are small places, let's say, of population size could be anywhere around about how much? About 1 million to 2 million people in those places where population density could be higher in those states. But the numbers are small for the district, and there has to be a decentralized approach where the current National Disaster Management Act gives the power to decide about district level policies through the collector, who has formed his own disaster management committee there for the district. They have to ensure that all the teachers and the workers in the school are immunized first. So there should be very little risk. When it comes to opening the schools, it has to be decided based on the local epidemiology that they are facing, in which the cases are getting reported from where. No, if they come to know about it, they should calculate R0, the RT value, if I am to be very accurate, the RT values, and those softwares are also with them. So this will happen gradually. Now, while doing that, they are also expected to offer the parents an option to still go ahead with online schooling versus physical attendance. And the other rules tend to be at the play, are going to be retained, that 30% physical attendance, then moving to 50% physical attendance in the schools. So gradually everybody will start going there. And if there is any issue that is associated with it, the issues are sorted out by telling the parents that if your child is sick, or if anybody in the family is having symptoms which could be closer to COVID, please don't send your child, isolate yourself and things like that. If any school reports an outbreak, the school will be shut down for some time and they will be asked to go for home isolation. But we are yet to experiment in a larger scale. We may have to still change our mind on what strategy will work the best.
I have 2 questions now sort of rolled into one, and we might just stop there. So the first one is, can you please highlight how India has helped its neighbors and surrounding countries manage the pandemic? And the second part is, when do you expect India to open its borders for NRI and OCI citizens? I think there are a lot of people in our audience who would be interested in that.
Well, the second one first, that would be better because it could be a one-liner. Currently, the government of India has said that by October end, they would still not open it up for international travelers. My gut feel is they would still wait uh, for the Diwali season to go. No, 15 days, at least 2 weeks after Diwali season, because it would not be prudent on our part to open up completely. We don't know, could this spread more? We have no idea, given the fact that people tend to congregate during that time or socialize more. Now, how are we helping others? We have actually helped others in a bigger way. No, if you recall the diagnostics that we provided diagnostics to others. When it came to all the supplies that entire network that we created, we offered it across. Even that CoWIN app, which is reckoned as one of the best apps, where even if you give the vaccine, the certificate can be rolled out immediately electronically across in the India. That has been provided to many countries as a gift. Then if you look at whoever was having, let's say, a severe outbreak, packages were given to them in terms of supplies as a gift from the country. When it came to vaccine dosages, there was a lot of criticism that was made against the government, that we donated 60 million dosages while we were providing vaccine to our frontline workers, which included healthcare workers. But at one point in time, the number of vaccine dosages was falling short. So, but as our Prime Minister says, nobody is safe until neighbors in your other areas are safe. So that approach will continue, to my mind. You will also see in this month, the shipments of vaccines for Covaxin and export are also going to be opened up because the capacity has increased immensely. I think I should stop at that. There are multiple things that we do, because basically, if you ask me, I would put it in a simple way. We generally do not think for ourselves all the time. We try to take everybody as much as possible together. If you actually look at the circumstances which we faced in the second wave, perhaps at no point in time we were receiving aids than what we used to do before. We were always there to help people out. This was a slight departure, but I'm sure we will overcome everything this time. We will be supporting everybody.
Dr. Gangakhetkar, there are a couple more questions, slightly more controversial. Can I put them to you?
Yeah.
So there's a question on ivermectin, because I think that was initially supported by India. But then obviously as the evidence emerged, that recommendation was dropped. So the question is whether you think ivermectin played a crucial role in bringing the cases down in India.
No. Ivermectin did not play a major role, whether in preventing acquisition or in treatment. It is just that, this was a time, this was a pandemic where nobody had any drug to offer to a patient. So people used to read a lot from the print media, where peer review was not actually occurring. The preprint reviews, preprint things, if you actually read, I don't think everybody understands evidence as much. And the result was everybody was fishing out for something. They picked up something. Some things became fashion because of the cost related issues or whatever. Some people felt they were comfortable with this drug because it doesn't lead to any other kind of a problem, and it started off. But ivermectin did not make a difference. Ivermectin was dropped. But there is one thing which people have to keep at the back of mind. Now, if it gets into any discussion mode, it becomes very difficult to drop, because then people also start asking questions. Why did you drop it? So you need solid evidence. So it took a little while to drop ivermectin. It was actually reckoned as a compound for research purposes and not for not for offering it to people. But these are issues which we will have to handle in subsequent pandemic through the learnings that we had.
And the absolute last question is on CCC-based isolation. Who funds and operates that, and is there any cost to the individual?
No. See, that I can tell with lot of national pride. If you take even RT-PCR or rapid antigen test in a government facility, it's free. Majority of the tests that occurred, they were occurring in government facilities. If I was to put a small number, I know the exact numbers used to be 10% in the month of June 2020. 10% was testing was done in private sector, 90 otherwise. Now, it is not only related to testing, but even for admissions in the CCCs, they were never levied charges for the same. In fact, the food part was also covered in the same. When it came to even admissions for those who were below poverty line, they have a kind of a ration card, which we call as yellow ration card, which shows that the person is below poverty line. The person would get the treatment free of cost from there. Now, in government sector, everything was free. But even if you get admitted in a private hospital and show that yellow card, the government would ensure that the cost is covered by the government and not by the person. What else? I think if you ask me, I think we have spent a huge amount of money in managing this pandemic. Almost everything was free unless a person desired the perceived quality. I want to do this at this particular place, which nobody can stop them. This is a purely democratic choice. But we provided everything, almost everything free.
Thank you so much.
Oh, I forgot one thing. Even for the private hospitals where people used to go and pay for their own services that they were receiving, there were caps that were put. If you are hospitalized, how much should be a cost of bed that you could levy every day? Whether it is ICU, whether it is a hospital bed, whatever you name. So, and any complaint that used to come, the hospital used to be penalized. It's not so easy as it appears. There may be reports of isolated instances, but it's such a big country. Unless you refer to the right kind of person, it becomes very difficult to even take action. So the capping was not only done for treatment, but it was also done for diagnostic tests also. Now, if you go to private sector, you will not be. Every state came out with a rule that he will charge only maximum amount that he can charge could be, let's say, 400 rupees for an RT-PCR. All those were laid down. So
Thank you, Dr. Ganga Khetkar. That was an amazing insight that you offered into COVID management in India. I'd just like to highlight our talk for next week. We have a speaker from India again, from the All India Institute of Medical Sciences, Associate Professor Neeraj Nischal. He will be talking about COVID-19 home-based care and monitoring. So encourage all our attendees to join in. And just a quick word about the program. We developed this in May, and there's more information about the program that can be found at the website link listed there. If you are a medical or healthcare professional, you can register to volunteer or to seek support using this link. Please contact us if required at international.health@anu.edu.au. Thank you all for attending. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Thank you.